So hello and welcome to Prosecutors for Black Lives. This is the final part in a three-part series on prosecutors and mass incarceration presented by ChangeLawyers and for the people. My name is Carlos. I use he and they pronouns, and I am the Chief Content Director at ChangeLawyers. I know that a lot of you in the audience are familiar with our organization, but for those of you who are not, ChangeLawyers is a legal foundation, and our goal is to fund the next generation of change makers, including the next generation of reform-minded DAs and public defenders. But before we begin, I do want to just acknowledge the world that we are living in, and I want to send my love out to everyone joining us today. The election was a week ago today, and it's been a week. And on top of that, 2020 has definitely felt very overwhelming at times, from COVID to the reckoning we had with racial justice, and now to the election. I often feel myself burned out. And yet at the same time, I remain grateful for spaces like this. And so with that in mind, I just want to set a couple of intentions for the next hour. In the next hour, we definitely value your honesty, your vulnerability, and your emotions. And we've asked our panelists to be as open and vulnerable as they're comfortable doing. And we encourage all of you to do that in the chat box as well. And we definitely value your identities, whatever they might be, racial, gender, sexual. So definitely wear them proudly on your sleeves. I do want to say just one thing to keep in mind, though. We will have a Q&A at the end of the hour. So that's what you should use the chat box and the Q&A box for. But keep in mind that this, what we're about to be talking about, is going to center the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So if you are not that, please keep that in mind, and please be mindful of how much space you take up in the chat box and in the Q&A box. So with that in mind, I do want to introduce you to our panelists today. And coincidentally, right after an election, we do have two elected people who have run for office joining us today. The first of which is District Attorney Diana Bechten, who is the District Attorney of Contra Costa County. She is, in her career, she's been a judge, a lawyer, a manager, and in 2017, she became the first Black woman DA in her county. Prior to that, for 22 years, she was a judge, and she has been elected as a presiding judge as well. She has many, many honors and distinctions, and she is also has had many firsts. And I know that a lot of the students who receive ChangeLawyers scholarships have definitely looked up to her as an example of who they want to be. We also have on our panel today public defender Manu Raju, who was elected public defender in San Francisco. He completed his undergraduate work at Columbia, holds a master's degree from Berkeley and a law degree from Berkeley Law. After 7 years as a deputy public defender in Contra Costa County, he joined the San Francisco office in 2008. And he has a reputation for being a formidable inside and outside the courtroom. And he is known in our social justice networks for upholding equity and humanity in the criminal justice system. And to round out our panel, we have Rose Khan from the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Rose is a nationally recognized expert in the field of immigrant post-conviction relief and oversees ILRC's pro bono immigrant post-conviction relief project. She has over 15 years of experience, and she is super, super knowledgeable on this. And we really want to hear her perspective because we believe that any conversation around criminal justice and mass incarceration is incomplete without talking about the immigrant experience. And your moderator for today will be Hillary Blount. Hillary has been moderating all three of these sessions. She is the founder and executive director For the People, a brand new organization that we are so incredibly proud and humbled to be supporting. They are an organization that's mission is to help prosecutors who want to change what a prosecutor does. So with that in mind, I'll hand it over to Hillary and our panel.
Thank you, Carlos. And again, thank you, ChangeLawyers, for giving us this platform to have this conversation. I'm going to try to keep this as like professional as possible, but I really want to just scream and yell. And I'm so excited because ChangeLawyers said that I could pick the panelists, and I love you guys so much. Like, you're right. So I've known you all, I've worked with you all, in the courtroom. We've battled some cases before. Anyway, I'm just so excited because I love all of you. But again, we're being watched by 120 people. So we'll get to our questions, and I'll keep the love and enthusiasm sort of tame. I'm super excited that there's so many people that are joining from the first session. I see a lot of names of folks that have been on for the first, from the first to the third. And if you are just joining today, this is the third of a 3-part series. And the first, we talked about, like, what do prosecutors do? What kind of power do they hold? And what kind of opportunity is there if we can harness some of that power? The last session that we had, we talked about the legacy of slavery and really the kind of acknowledgement and recognition that so much lives still in our day-to-day profession, and the importance and critical timeliness of being able to address that, especially as prosecutors, and sort of that reckoning. And today, we were very intentional about having this be after the election. We were praying and hoping that the conversation would be what it's about to be and not something different. Obviously, if the results were not what they were, this would be a very different conversation. And so we're really excited that we have this opportunity to have this conversation. So obviously a lot has happened since the last panel. And I think that, as a country, we are having this collective sigh of relief. But I think also as we exhale this sigh of relief, we're also thinking about what needs to be done, right? And we've seen, God bless social media and the internet, and we've seen people say, we celebrate tonight and we ride at dawn. So I think a lot of us are very much focused on what will the work look like. Many of us, all three of you, especially, have been playing defense for a very, very long time. And it's felt like we haven't been able to be proactive and play offense. So now that those barriers are theoretically and hopefully lifted, and the call for change is loud and clear, we've seen it, we've heard it, what are we going to prioritize as we move forward on this new horizon? So I want to kick it off with DA Bechten, like we do all of these sessions. We start with Black women, and who better to start with than you, DA Bechten. And so for you, I wanted to start the conversation. Now that we have a new administration coming and theoretically some barriers out of the way, how do you see the role of the DA shifting or improving or accelerating now that we have a new administration and sort of a new renewed sense of purpose, given what we've heard in the streets for so many months?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hillary, and I want to thank the ChangeLawyers for bringing us into this platform and have this discussion. So glad to be with you. Yes, that's an interesting question, and I think that for us as prosecutors, we of course in this moment are going to recognize that one, the people have spoken, and I think all over the country, given all of the events that have taken place and that collective sigh that you just talked about, we are now able to step back and feel that we can go forward, and that hopefully that we have new allies who are willing to come forward with us as well. I think we've talked about this before, but I think it's so important to recognize the tremendous amount of power and discretion that prosecutors have. And I think so many of us now are having these discussions. We're feeling, yes, we've done some things, but there's so much more work for us to do. And I think that's kind of the where we're living in. We're recognizing that our decisions can have tremendous impact in our communities, and not just in our communities locally, but reverberating around our state and hopefully around our country as we begin to feel empowered with additional power to be able to speak about issues about equity in our system, about fairness in our system, and how do we as prosecutors who have played a significant role that we must acknowledge in fueling mass incarceration, how do we begin to use the power that we have, use the discretion that we have to begin to turn that tide? And so I think that's the conversation that we are hopefully having right now. Thank you.
Right, exactly. Turning the tide. Let me ask you, Rose. I mean, I know that the last 4 years have been defense, not as much offense. And I'm curious from your perspective, does this feel like there's opportunities to push new things? I know that you've, drafted several laws for California, and you've done a ton of training across the state and across the country, talking to DAs about ways that they could be better showing up for the non-citizen community. And I guess I'm wondering, if does this new administration and this change mean that DAs are going to start lining up, like come asking you to come help them? I mean, they should have been lining up for, a while, but like, is that what's happening? Is that what's going to happen?
Right. Well, we are at a real inflection point. We have been liberated, fingers crossed, from a racist, xenophobic, white supremacist. And my colleagues and I have put together a blueprint for the Biden administration to not only restore what has been lost over the last 4 years, but also to forge a new way forward that recognizes the dignity of all people and brings us closer to becoming the country that we all hope to live in. But there's no overstating the trauma and real harm that has been inflicted on immigrants and other communities of color over the last 4 years. And it will take a lot to undo that harm and that trauma. But I will also be honest, the fact that Trump was so blatant in his attacks against immigrant communities and communities of color meant that we had new allies coming forward to work with us that before hadn't seen immigration as a cutting edge issue. So whereas under the Obama administration, I've been doing this work for a long time, under the Obama administration, I had to spend the first 15 minutes of all of my presentations trying to convince people that deportation was a critical civil rights issue. Over the last 4 years, I could cut out those 15 minutes of the presentation because people came to the table already knowing that this was a cutting edge issue and we needed all hands on deck to make a difference. So one of my concerns is really keeping the urgency up, not letting people think because there has been a change in the executive branch, somehow we're off the hook. It is still true that 97% of all deportations occur as a result of someone's local contact with the criminal legal system. It is still true that the architecture that President Trump used to deport record numbers of individuals continues to be there. This was laid forth in 1996 immigration laws. So it is all, the foundation is all still there, and we still need all hands on deck doing what we can to repair the harm that's been caused, protect against future harm, and work together towards a new future where we respect the dignity of all people.
Thank you. I want to ask you, Mano, on that. Is it ever actually possible that the people that you've been battling with for I don't want to say your entire career, but a pretty long career in a couple different offices across the state, that we can be allies? Can we actually work together? And what, if that's possible, what does that look like?
I think it's certainly possible. and a lot of that's going to depend on the individual prosecutors that are actually appearing in court and making filing decisions. But I also think it's, it's crucially important in this moment that we allow ourselves and provide space for amplification of the stories. I think one of the big problems with the system is for so long, people have been put in boxes called defendants, and we haven't really been amplifying the full humanity of the people who are caught in the system. And that goes from people in prison, people in county jail, people in pretrial detention, just everywhere along the system. So I think the first thing is to truly listen to the stories of those who have been most impacted. And that's something that, we try to do through media, and we're going to continue our efforts in that direction. But then another area I think is just a lot of time from the defense community, what we're asking for really is a fair fight to begin with. And I think when you have issues like pretrial detention, overcharging in instances, and trial taxes, it's very difficult to have that fair fight. And I think when we're allowed to have that fair fight, we're going to see a lot more just outcomes. So that I think that's another crucial piece of this.
I want to ask you a question on that.
Sure.
I'm going to push a little bit. Are prosecutors unfair?
Some are. Many are fair, but many are unfair. And
how does it show up? Like, how does the fairness show up?
Right. It shows up in prosecuting decisions. I mean, it is not uncommon at all for, and let me say, I'm not interested in really labeling individuals, but actions, okay? Because I do believe in the possibility, the same way I'm a defense attorney, I believe in the possibility for everyone of change and redemption, and that cuts across the board. But having said that, it is not uncommon to show up at an arraignment and see a prosecutor at the table next to you saying this person is a danger to public safety, they're a flight risk, and then 9 days later when it's the day for the preliminary hearing, they can be released, just plead guilty to this, and they can go home. That same 9 days later, the only thing that's changing is now they're securing a conviction. And that's an example of the problem with pretrial detention. And then the overcharging, I believe that there are people up and down the state and across the country every single day who are pleading guilty to things that they should not plead guilty to. And I think they're pleading guilty to those because of these, what I'll call the three in my opinion, evils of the system, which are pretrial detention, overcharging, and a trial tax. The fear that if I get convicted, like I want to go to trial in this case, the offer's 3 years, I don't think I'm guilty, but a district attorney is telling me, well, if you can go, but just so you know, I might be asking for 15, 18 years if you get convicted. And that intimidates a lot of people into pleading guilty who shouldn't be. Having said that, I think there's a lot of room for people to make more fair charging decisions. I think there's room for us to reframe the way we look at jury trials and the way we look at hearings and really see those as opportunities to flesh out things and not as something to punish someone for having exercised that right. And I think that it's possible to have more fair charging decisions so that we can actually use the system and use the due process protections that have been in our system for a long time.
Can I ask, can I follow up with you, DA Bechten, on what was explained? Again, if we're trying to figure out how, and there's a lot of prosecutors that have logged on to this conversation, to this panel, and I think sometimes, and I love what you said, Mano, about like we're all redeemable, right? Because I mean, even for myself, I feel like I've evolved over time. I felt like I was fair when I was in the courtroom, but when I started working with community leaders and Miss Khan right here, my perspective started to shift, and I felt like I just had a better sense of my own blind spots. So I appreciate what you're saying, that like the redemption story or opportunity applies to all of us. But DA Bechten, I'm curious about what you think in terms of the trial tax, pretrial diversion, and overcharging. Those are things that have been part of the system for a really long time. And there's this argument that if we let every case go to trial, that the whole system's going to collapse. And I remember being trained that you start with a higher, what you're willing to take is higher, so that you can go through the negotiation process, and maybe it whittles down, or maybe it whittles up with the trial tax. Can you share what you think about those parts of our system, and if there's a way that those can, I don't know, be ameliorated or removed from the system in general? And especially because you were on the bench for 22 years, and then also now as the elected DA.
Well, I think I want to talk about that in a couple of different ways. And I think the first part of what we've talked about before is recognizing the enormous amount of discretion and power that we have in that courtroom. From, as you mentioned, the charges that are filed in a case, to the plea bargaining tactics that we use, to making the decisions about, which cases are appropriate to go to trial, which cases are appropriate for some other type of disposition. And so we have that power, but as we hold that power, I think we also have to stress the whole notion of the human side of everyone. We are often, as prosecutors, always talking about bringing justice to victims, but we seldom talk about the fact that we are responsible. We are the gatekeepers. And so our responsibility is really to try to bring justice and fairness and equitable principles forward for everyone. And so if we are continuing to use those kinds of practices of overcharging just so that we can get something, it means that we're not necessarily acting in a way that's fair and equitable for everyone. I think that once we are willing as prosecutors to acknowledge that we have been part of the drivers of mass incarceration, then we have decisions to make. We have to make decisions as prosecutors as to whether or not we are going to do the work to rectify the inherent harms in our legal system, or are we going to continue to perpetrate them? And I would like to stand for the side that says we're going to do everything that we can to try to rectify those past harms. It means that, one, we have to talk about the problem. We have to become self-aware. We have to recognize that we have an ethical duty to advance racial equity-minded policies, that we have an ethical duty to involve our communities in discussion so that we can hear how we are affecting our communities. We have an obligation to train our prosecutors, not only in the principles that you talked about, that you were trained in, but how do we train to be mindful of race and equity, fairness. We encourage our prosecutors, for example, to go to the places where we send people, to go to prisons. Our juvenile teams have all visited our juvenile hall and all of the facilities where our children are being sent. All of these things help us to be more sensitive to the people and all of the people and the needs that we're serving. I think we have to stand strongly on platforms that really give us promises of hope, of equity and fairness for everyone, and holding ourselves accountable, which I'm sure we're going to get to as part of our conversation. How do we make sure that, one, we become aware of how our policies are affecting our communities? Part of that is making sure that we are looking at our data, which is something that very often prosecutors haven't done. We haven't gotten our statistics. We haven't looked deeply into how we have affected our communities. And that's something that we are currently, in my office, committed to doing. We're doing that work right now, fortunately, with the Vera Institute. So we are taking a deep dive into our office's practices and policies and procedures and our outcomes, so that we can find out if we've had disparate impacts on certain parts of our community, and making sure that our community is aware of the information that we find, and also being able to be transparent about what we find and the shifts that we're making in our policies, so that we can be held accountable to the people that we serve as we go forward.
follow up with what you're saying about data. Rose, you had also just mentioned, you know, and I've seen your presentations where you've talked about this sort of mass number of people that are deported for these like, local actions that are happening. And I'm curious for us as a nation, is data going to be the thing that sets us free? Is it, I mean, because it's like prosecutors just can open their eyes and look to the left and look to the right and can see how many people are Black and brown. You know, but we hear a lot, and we're really trying to get the data to sort of justify what we're all seeing. And so I'm curious, and I want to turn it to you, and then also to the public defender, about the ways in which data might be able to help us in this next part of our crusade.
Yeah, no, data will not set us free, but I'm sure that DA Bechten also believes that data will not set us free. You know, a scholar, Charlene Cruthers, has said that incomplete stories lead to incomplete solutions. And I think we've been allowing ourselves to be lulled to sleep by these incomplete stories. And as public defender Raju suggested, we need to be hearing about the impact of our policies and practices on the very communities that we are saying that we're serving. Both we as immigrant rights attorneys, we as prosecutors, and we as public defenders. That is what accountability looks like. So until we center the stories and create opportunities to hear those stories, we will not be functioning with enough information to create the solutions necessary to really dream together about what a whole new future looks like. So I really implore all of us in every area of our lives to start looking more deeply at how we can hear the stories of the people that we've harmed, about how we can work together to address that harm, because there will not be a one-size-fits-all approach. I think we are all familiar with the standard array of interventions that we're demanding prosecutors make, whether that's, you know, more diversion programs or, you know, mass expungements, etc. But there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to what has been centuries of racist prosecution. So we need to be listening to the stories of the impacted communities and creating opportunities to continue to learn from those stories and work hand in hand to create case-specific policies that then we bubble up and hold all of our staff accountable to upholding.
I want to turn that to you, Mano, about accountability, and then come back to DA Bechten just on that topic. You know, this panel is about the ways in which prosecutors can show up differently, and that's the work that, you know, many of us are doing. Is there any way that public defenders can show up differently as well to sort of help to accelerate what needs to be done?
Thank you for that question. And let me also say, I should have said this earlier, but you hit me with a tough question, so I jumped right into it. I do really appreciate being on this panel, and even the way that Carlos introduced us and, you know, warned or encouraged all of us to make spaces for BIPOC voices to begin with. The fact that you started with DA Bechten as a Black woman, I think that to me is symbolic and the energy we need to be sort of going forward with. And I've seen that in other spaces like youth development spaces, but I don't often see that type of consciousness in lawyer spaces. So I really appreciate you carrying us forward that way and holding the space in that way. 100%. Public defenders, I think, need to show up in a more race conscious way, in a more empathetic way, in a more community, not just client centered, but community centered way. One thing that I've encouraged people to do, I've had some success defending on gang cases. And one thing that I always encourage individuals to do is to go sit in the grandmother's home of your client, look at family photos, talk to people in the community. You're going to transform who you are in your relationship to that client if you put yourself in that space. And unfortunately, too many defenders actually don't do that enough. I'll often get calls from someone from another county, hey, do you have a community expert, for me in this case? And I'm like, well, I'm not in your community. So I have a community expert for my communities, but you actually have to go into your community to find those community experts and bring them forward. And there's definitely ways that if we get to know our clients better, if we spend, that extra 20 minutes with our client in our initial meetings, if we, we put in a requirement that in addition to having the meeting within a certain amount of time, all of our felony attorneys have to reach out to a community member of our client within the first week of representing them. Because I want our people representing not just our client, but realizing that every individual is a member of a broader community. That's just a fact. And we shouldn't be treating our clients as if they're not. And to the extent we can show up more fully, it's going to help all of the other players in the system to respond in a more complete manner. And I love that quotation, incomplete stories lead to incomplete solutions. And I think we're going to have more complete solutions if we also take it upon ourselves to show up in a much more complete way.
I want to turn this then to DA Bechten on that, incomplete stories. I mean, one of the things that's complicated about the system, right, is that DAs and prosecutors aren't actually having conversations directly with clients. And as you mentioned, DA Bechten, one of the things that your office has been doing has been having your line deputies going into the prisons and getting a better sense of those stories and those conversations and the redemption stories that are profound inside of our prisons. And I guess I wonder if incomplete stories lead to incomplete solutions, how can we be getting fuller stories during the criminal justice process? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, Nina, DA Bechten, has some of that ever kind of limited? I mean, as a judge, you were able to get the fuller story, and now that you're sometimes, now that you're on the prosecution side, how does that sort of show up in the practice? And have you ever thought as well about having some of your line staff, just like the public defender said, going out into these communities? I know you yourself have been part of Ceasefire. You've marched in the streets. You've been out there in communities in Richmond and all of that. Wondering how many people from your office have as well, and how that could potentially shape things moving forward.
I think there's a couple of things, and Rose, I want to thank you. It's just a wonderful quote for us to sort of land and sit with for a while, and that is the issue of incomplete stories. And I think it is tremendously important that we not try to sit back in our offices and just look at our data and try to think that we can somehow use just that information to change the injustices that have occurred. We have to be willing, I think, as prosecutors, not only personally as leaders in our office, but encouraging everyone in our office to also have a much more community-minded focus. And so many of our attorneys already do that, are already very involved. We have established a community academy so that we bring a group of people into our office once or twice a year to hear all about what we do. And we can also hear their perspective about the legal justice system, and that's helpful as well. But I think the other thing that has been completely empowering, I think, is to also make sure that we are engaging with our community. There have been so many forums that have powerfully influenced me and my thinking when I have never said one single solitary word. Sitting in the powerful, humbling space, for example, of a listening session, where you simply allow people from our communities to come and to talk about their experiences in our juvenile justice system, experiences in our foster care system, experiences in our courtrooms, and just listen to those stories, how people have been affected by what we have done, how they've been affected by every aspect of the criminal justice system, and making sure that we are hearing those voices loud and clear, so that as we are shaping policies, we are also responding to those stories, including those stories in the way that we go forward. So I think that community engagement piece is so very important. Not only being out and about in our community, engaging and planning with our community. We had a particular issue in a particular part of our county where the community voiced loud and clear there, really from all aspects of our criminal justice system, saying, you've not responded to us properly. And so it was really an honor and a pleasure to put together a group that included every voice that the community wanted to have at the table, to say, we're here to work with you on solutions, to not come in and tell you what we think is the right way to go forward or the wrong way, but to get engaged, to hear your voices, and to work with you as we solve problems like human trafficking and sex trafficking in this community that are so devastating to all of you. How do we work together, and how do we shape policies that will take into account your voices and your stories? So that's been a very important part of our work, and I'm glad it's something that we've been able to put to the forefront.
And following up on that, DA Bechten, you've just laid out, basically we can just transcribe what you just said, and that can be basically tools and tips, things that DAs can be doing across the state, across the country. And there are a lot of things that you have been doing and trying to move the needle. I want to ask you, as of the first 167 years, the first Black woman DA in Contra Costa County, I know that there are obviously ways in which your community can relate to you in a different way, but I'm also curious about what unique challenges that you have had to deal with and confront being a Black woman in this position, and how you've been able to kind of overcome or address some of those additional barriers that Black women face daily, but especially in an elected position like what you hold.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. Because we are we often talk about what it's like to be the first this, to break the barriers, and I'll just take this moment to say how very proud we can all stand to witness our first woman, first Black woman, first person of color, first so many first be getting prepared to be sworn in as the vice president of our country. I am so and proud and encouraged by this particular moment. But I think the other thing that we also have to recognize, and that we also overlook, is the challenges that come with the position of being a first. The challenges that can come not only from on the outside of the office, but also that can come from within the office. There are so many of us around the country, Black women prosecutors. We have to recognize that we're still very much in the minority. Of the 2,400 or so elected prosecutors in the country, only 1% are women of color. It's a good thing that there are few of us who are also Black women have been able to form connections around the country, because this work has been very challenging. We are attacked in so many different ways. We've received death threats from around the country. And so it is a very much a space to hold, but also to have the support of other people who are going through the same things that you're going through in these challenging moments. But I think that it's also important to recognize that we are part of a movement now. We are not just here, as so many people have said, in a moment, but we are truly part of a movement that is about bringing fairness and equity to a system that for so long has had its foot on the necks and the backs of so many people. And so I think it's that kind of a balance. Understand that we are in a place where a lot of people don't want to see us, don't want us to have these positions, don't want us to use our platform to try to bring a different voice, a different kind of healing to our communities that have been suffering for so long. But at the same time, recognizing the tremendous weight and responsibility that we carry to our communities who have elected us and placed us in these positions of trust, to do everything that we can, to be bold in our leadership and to stand up and say, these are policies that are wrong, they are not fair, they do not bring any kind of justice to our system, and we really begin to think about and help others to see what it means to truly be a gatekeeper of justice for our communities. So that's just kind of the space that I live in. We understand the dangers of it, but we also understand the tremendous responsibility of trying to move the conversation forward for our country and for our people.
Oh, that gave me chills. Wow, it is such a tremendous opportunity and responsibility that we're all holding, but especially the three of you and the roles that you are playing and have been playing for many years. God, are we that old? Is it decades? Geez, okay. On that, I wanted to, before we open it up to some questions in the Q&A, I wanted to ask you if there were 2 tips that you could provide about what allyship could look like. And first, how you define allyship, and then what the 2 tips would be about what that could look like for prosecutors in being a better ally in the work that you all are doing. So I'm gonna go in reverse, and I'm gonna end with DA Bechten. And so I'll start with you, Rose. What are your tips for allyship? How could we show up, prosecutors show up better moving forward?
Well, I always go back to the notion, and I have to hold this dear as close to my heart as a white U.S. citizen who tries to stand not just as an ally but as an accomplice to my friends and communities of color. But allyship is a verb. It is not a place. It's not a destination. It's an act, and we must. It is not enough to declare yourself an ally. That little black box on your Instagram square at the height of the uprisings in the summer actually won't get the job done. So it's about the day-to-day actions, the moment-to-moment actions that we are all taking. And so that's as true for me as a white person trying to dismantle systems of white supremacy, as it is for prosecutors trying to dismantle systems of mass incarceration. So we must be in constant action. And just because we have been anointed a reformer does not mean that we have, reached the mountaintop. It's a constant process, and it's iterative is the other part, where there's the list of reforms that we ask people to make, that we're in the process of making, but then those needs may shift. So that's where it goes back to the conversation topic that has kind of woven all of our answers together, which is the need to stay accountable and stay in communication with your community, and define community broadly. You know, some people appoint themselves leaders of the community. Some people might not even know there are community meetings happening. So really look to expand the notion of who is community and stay accountable. So to break that down again, 2 points: allyship is a verb, stay in action. And second, stay accountable and look for ways to create accountability, whether it's those monthly meetings with different members of the community, whether it's, you know, creating community to prosecutor evaluations, you know, much the same way my kids get their report cards from their teachers. If we are truly supposed to protect public safety, well, what does the public think about us? Not just every 4 years at election, but what do they think about us leading up to that? What do they think of us in the month-to-month meetings we have with them? So creating systems of accountability will ensure that we know what to do, that we know what steps to take as we, you know, constantly strive to be in action around allyship.
Thank you. Thank you for distilling it to 2 points. Everyone write that down at home. Okay, so turning to you, my friend, Mano, what could we be doing differently? How can we be better allies in this work?
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to be as succinct or limited to 2, but let me say, first of all, I think it's to actually recognize the need for that allyship. I mean, I don't think we would have won this election without the Black Lives Matter movement, period. And I think it's really important that that be recognized in this moment. I think we were in this George Floyd moment that has created an international awareness and greater race consciousness. And I think that momentum is what won this election. And I'm really appreciative that Vice President-elect Kamala Harris recognized off top that Black women delivered this election. So let's understand the need for the allyship, because it is people of color and particularly Black communities that delivered this election, Black and Brown communities. As far as what we need to do, I think that as public defenders, if we're doing our job at the highest level, we're going to bring a lot to the table that's going to enable the prosecutor to make the more humane decision. But we have to have the energy, but as importantly, the resources to make that happen. So I think that progressive prosecutors should be pushing for funding for public defender offices, because it's only when we provide the fuller space of who that individual is through social histories and through a deep dive into that individual community, and if we can bring a fuller sense of the facts through investigation, then the decision is justified. A lot of times when there's a criticism of a decision that might be considered progressive by a prosecutor, the criticism of that is based on just looking at the police report. But if the public knew the fuller sense of who that individual was and knew the fuller sense of what those facts were, which frankly often only happens as we get closer to trial, when we start turning over our witness statements and our experts, and there's a fuller sense, then that decision is much more capable of being understood and will reverberate better with the community. So, but for that, we have to be empowered to do our jobs as effectively as possible. And then I think from that, I would just say, I mean, it gets back to this, I think the incomplete stories leads to incomplete solutions. It really is individualized. And I think the bigger story that we can paint, then the more individualized decision can be made if people are coming with an open heart and mind and really listening in that way.
Thank you. Support resources going to public defender offices so that they can dig deeper and tell a fuller story. And also, just before any of this, just recognize allyship is critical. So lastly, certainly last but not least, DA Bechten, what are the 2 tips that you would give to your colleagues out there in the line prosecutors elected in the state, across the country, about allyship and how we can show up in a different way in this moment,
Mhm.
in this movement. Let me
In this
stand
movement.
corrected. In this movement.
In the movement. Well, I think the first that I would want to recognize is that as we begin to recognize the role that we have played towards leading us to this space of mass incarceration, that we also have to make a commitment to decrease our footprint. So I think that will help, that commitment will help us to begin on the path of being better allies. And then that is a commitment that will come with a commitment to do everything that we can to reduce the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. That is going to be so important for us going forward. And then the second thing I think is very important is to increase the transparency in prosecutor offices. So committing to bringing fairness and equity to our system, and also to be transparent about our policies, because that is one of the ways that we will be able to be more accountable to the communities that we serve. And so, and then the final thing, I want to make sure that we are putting in place changes that can be sustainable. Not just things that are going to be here for a day, but that when we are no longer in these positions, they will be ingrained, they will be a part of who we are becoming. I'm so grateful that we've had the opportunity to partner even with Hillary and with Rose to bring in immigration training to our office. We've been able to bring in bias training, implicit bias. And so all of our prosecutors are participating in these forums as part of a mandatory training. So we are heightening that awareness. And then I think our work with the Vera Institute, which really is broadening the eyes of all of our attorneys about the issues leading to mass incarceration. So I think we can be better allies with those better resources, committing to reducing our footprint in the criminal justice system, and then finally being transparent so that our communities in those conversations with us can hold us accountable.
Ooh, masterclass. That was incredible. I want to turn to the questions, and it sounds like DA Bechten, you've answered one of them that came from Tiffany Gibson, who we know, right? I know who that is. And the question was, what are some of the policies implemented in Contra Costa County? And so you have answered that already for us. And so that's great. Just hearing more about some of the things that have been done in the office already. I want to turn to one of the questions here, going back to the question around pretrial detention, and turn this to all of you, but because it affects all of your work and your clients and your victims and everybody. If we don't believe that innocent people should be held pretrial, how do we envision a future where pretrial detention doesn't exist? Or, you know, like if you could wave a magic wand, what would happen in the justice system when a person is charged with a crime? And I'll start with you, Mano, on that one.
Well, I think an honest look at the vast majority of people who are charged with a crime is that they are going to show up to court and they're not a danger to community. And I think if we actually look at individuals and support them, then we can get through the process without pretrial detention. I think for too long, pretrial detention has frankly been used as a way to extract pleas. And people in the system day-to-day know that. But if we start actually honestly looking at the situation, having full hearings, enabling the judge to see the community that's going to hold, that providing adequate services, we can get started on, because oftentimes whether someone's guilty or not, there may have been a certain circumstance that led them to being arrested. So that underlying issue can be addressed while that person's on the outside, which is contributing to public safety. And the legal process can take the shape that it's going to take with that individual out of custody.
Right. Okay. There's a solution that we can. I want to. I'm seeing a question in here, which I'm very excited to have. And the question is that it was a great topic that was advertised for this discussion, but that the immigrant attorney or non-citizen kind of comments aren't entirely sort of fitting in with the conversation. And so I'm not trying to call anybody out, but I love this question because this was the exact same thing that I asked of Rose in 2014, because she kept talking about mass deportation and I was talking about mass incarceration, and I just didn't understand why she was saying that they were connected. And so, Rose, do you want to jump in and answer that question about why they are inextricably linked and we can't talk about ending mass incarceration without talking about mass deportation?
Sure. So there are many different ways to enter that conversation. The first is California is the most immigrant-rich state in the country. 1 out of every 4 of us was born outside of the United States, and 1 out of every 2 children in California go to bed at night with a parent who was born outside of the United States. As I said at the outset, 97% of all deportations occur as a result of that individual's contact with the local criminal legal system. So if we care about keeping families together, if we care about the stability of our communities, then we also must care about more deeply understanding the way the criminal legal system and the immigration legal system work hand in hand to create a double punishment on immigrant communities. And we must look at ways to disconnect those systems. And we have seen DA Bechten and Public Defender Raju take incredible stances that really reflect an understanding of the integration of these systems. In Contra Costa, they adopted one of the first policies in the state requiring all of their line deputies to take into account immigration consequences when plea bargaining. The San Francisco Public Defender's Office has one of only 2 public defender-based immigration defense teams that defend people every day against deportation. So increasingly, we really cannot talk about fighting mass incarceration without also talking about the fastest growing industry of mass incarceration, which is the mass immigration detention system. So I think it's important that we continue to integrate this in all of our conversations and develop new and tailored policies to address this.
Thank you. I remember that similar speech back in 2014, and I've been saying it ever since. I want to go to one of the other questions that's here, and I think this is both for DA Bechten and Public Defender Raju, that in rural communities, people of color are rarely represented in both offices, and the comment is it's usually the same person for years on both sides. And so we have a lot of people that are tuning in to this discussion in law school, or maybe they're or working at a firm, they're lawyers, maybe they're considering making a change because of this new opportunity that we have with the new administration, hopefully. What would you say about that topic, about the ways in which we could shift shift some of that, and how important is it to have people of color in these positions on both sides? And I'll start with you, Raju.
I think it's crucial. I think it's, to the extent we can bring people into the system who look and can empathize and have that cultural competency, to connect with the communities that represent, it's just vital. And that's not to say that people who aren't from that communities can't do the things that are necessary to bridge that gap, but there's, I think, no doubt that all these offices become richer when we have just more inclusion. We've recently hired a director of equity and engagement in my office to precisely try to accomplish that and to make sure we have a pipeline, a racial justice pipeline, from law schools, from paralegal institutions, from colleges, directly into our office to give people exposure to that and hopefully give them the training to possibly get opportunities within our office, but if not, get that training so they can go do work in other public defender offices or in allied organizations.
And so just like how we started, we are going to end with you, DA Bechten, on that point. The importance of having people of color in these positions. If you could close us out and talk about that as our final point on today's panel discussion.
Yeah, and I agree with Raju that it's critical. All of us have unique perspectives, and we all bring something different to the table. And that's why it's so important to have a variety of voices at the table. I think it's extremely important for our offices to be very intentional about reaching out and recruiting attorneys from a variety of backgrounds. And I'm really proud of the work that we've been able to do in Contra Costa County. It really begins to change the conversation. It changes the outlooks that people have. We are able to come into the room and bring our own experiences, our own stories, that may not have been considered in the past. And so it is extremely important for us to all be at the table, to all have our perspectives heard, to all have our stories heard as we make decisions that are so important for our entire communities. We must represent the people. We need to look like and represent the people that we serve.
Thank you. So if anybody out there is looking to get more involved, I know that all three of the panelists will take interns, pro bono attorneys, right? And so if anybody's listening and is wanting to find a way to plug in, there are many. And so hopefully this discussion has given people some food for thought about different ways that we can all be showing up in this moment. So with that, look, I would love to be an intern. So yes, wouldn't you all want to work with any one of these folks? So anyway, with that, I just want to thank you guys so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation, for being honest and sort of exploring areas that don't typically come up in these types of conversations. And thank you all for the work that you all are doing. Public Defender Raju and Rose Khan and DA Bechten, thank you so much. And thank you for all the panelists, over 100 people that stuck with us even though we were over time. And obviously, thank you so much to ChangeLawyers for creating this platform for us to have this talk.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you.